In 1816, France was going through a major transition phase. Napoleon had been defeated, and King Louis XVIII was restored to the throne. As part of reasserting its colonial presence, the French government would send a fleet to reclaim Senegal. Leading these ships was the Medusa, a 40-gun frigate that would undergo one of the most disturbing oceanic disasters in history. The man put in charge of the Medusa was Captain Hugues de Roy de Chaumaret, a nobleman who hadn't commanded a ship in over 25 years. After decades away from the helm, Chaumaret was unprepared for the perils that awaited him, a gap in experience that would set the stage for unimaginable catastrophe. Nonetheless, he was trusted with this critical mission, carrying 400 passengers including soldiers, settlers, and government officials. This mission was part of King Louis XVIII's effort to restore French influence and prestige after Napoleon's defeat. The Treaty of Paris in 1814 restored former colonies to France, including the key port of St. Louis in Senegal. Strategically located at the mouth of the Senegal River, St. Louis had anchored French trade in Africa since the 17th century, providing access to valuable resources like gold, ivory, and gum arabic. Captured by the British during the Napoleonic Wars, St. Louis now represented France's renewed opportunities in West Africa. To solidify their hold here, the French government dispatched a fleet of 4 vessels to Senegal, led by the Medusa, the mission's flagship. On board were 400 passengers, including soldiers, settlers, and key officials like Colonel Julien Schmaltz, appointed as the new governor of Senegal. These settlers hoped to start a new life in the colony. Artisans, farmers, and their families all would endure the sweltering, cramped conditions below deck for this promised opportunity. The Medusa, a 40-gun frigate from the Napoleonic Wars, was one of the French fleet's most impressive ships, combining firepower with the speed to outmaneuver British vessels. Yet on this mission, its greatest flaw was its captain. Chaumaret, reinstated by the royalist government under King Louis XVIII, represented the wave of nobles rewarded for loyalty to the newly restored monarchy, often without regard for their qualifications. It was a choice that would bring devastating consequences for all on board. From the start of the trip, Chaumaret ignored his officers' advice to follow a more indirect course that avoided the dangers near the African coast. He wanted to show off and impress the crown with his abilities by taking a much more risky direct route. As the Medusa sped along under Chaumaret's reckless command, tensions ran high among the officers. They feared that their captain's choices were leading them into danger, but nonetheless reluctantly respected the chain of command. After pushing forward with his daring course, the fleet used the island of Madeira, located northwest off the African coast, as a midway stopping point. Here, they took a break from sea and resupplied their ships. And during this break, the captains of the other ships took the opportunity to criticize Chaumaret's navigation. The 2 smallest ships had been struggling to keep pace, and for the remaining leg of the trip, Captain Chaumaret wanted to keep a tight route along the notoriously dangerous West African coast to get to St. Louis as quickly as possible. The other captains argued, but it was clear that Chaumaret would not change his mind. After leaving Madeira, Chaumaret began to navigate along his direct route, traveling dangerously close to the shoreline despite the numerous reefs and shallow sandbanks in this area. The 2 smallest ships, the Loire and Argus, began falling behind again, unable to keep up with the Medusa and wary of the unsafe conditions of the route. Their captains, a bit more tempered by experience, made the decision to veer further out to sea on a safer course, leaving the Echo and Medusa to continue alone. Initially tasked with safely leading the 4 ships to Senegal, Captain Chaumaret now found himself with only one remaining traveling companion. As the Medusa and Echo pressed forward, a tragic accident further shook the crew's confidence. A young boy struggling with the sails lost his footing and fell overboard. He managed to grab a rope for a moment, but the ship's speed tore it from his hands, sending him into the churning waves. The crew fired a signal shot to alert the Echo trailing behind and threw a life buoy overboard. However, the Echo couldn't locate the boy in time, and he disappeared into the ocean, never to be seen again. This loss cast a shadow over the voyage, intensifying everyone's anxieties, and with the tragedy fresh in his mind, the Echo's captain began to notice the waters growing dangerously shallow. He'd had enough of Chaumaret's risky leadership, and he made the choice to abandon the Medusa, steering further out to join the Argus and Loire at safer depths. But of course, Chaumaret was undeterred and held fast to his direct course towards Senegal. Meanwhile, the crew and passengers aboard the Medusa grew increasingly uneasy. Chaumaret did little to ease their concerns when he appointed an inexperienced passenger named Richefort as the navigator. Richefort's appointment was a result of Chaumaret's poor judgment and the social dynamics on board. Although Richefort was an esteemed philosopher and a member of the Philanthropic Society of Cape Verde, he had no practical navigation experience. Chaumaret violated naval regulations requiring certified officers with extensive maritime training to hold critical navigational roles. By appointing Richefort, an untrained civilian likely to appease influential passengers, he displayed a troubling preference for social connections over protocol and competence. Richefort's confident facade convinced Chaumaret that he'd chosen an excellent advisor, but his inexperience soon became clear. Nearing the West African coast, Richefort mistook a cloud bank for Cape Blanco, a crucial navigational landmark, leading the Medusa dangerously off course toward Banque d'Arguin, a treacherous zone of hidden sandbars near Mauritania. Unaware of their error, Chaumaret and Richefort pressed on, oblivious to the danger ahead. Although Chaumaret and Richefort failed to notice the muddy bottom, First Lieutenant Maudet sensed danger and dropped a sounding line to check the depth. Finding only 30 feet to the ocean floor, with the Medusa's hull extending 19 feet down, Maudet urgently warned the captain. Chaumaret reluctantly ordered a turn, but it was far too late. The Medusa came to a thudding halt, grounded 31 miles off the African coast. Initially, the crew was determined to refloat the ship, but they had struck at high tide, meaning the situation would worsen as the tide went out. To free the Medusa, they needed to lighten its load by unloading cargo. Although it carried only 14 of its original 40 cannons, since France was not at war, these cannons were the heaviest items on board and the obvious choice to discard. However, Captain Chaumaret refused to disarm his ship, insisting that the cannons remain in place in case of an unexpected enemy encounter. With each minute lost, the Medusa settled deeper into the thick mud, sealing its fate. Eventually, the crew decided to build a large raft to offload passengers and cargo, hoping this would lighten the Medusa enough to free it from the reef. Over the next few days, they salvaged plankwood and beams from the ship to construct a massive raft, which they nicknamed La Machine. Measuring 66 feet long and 23 feet wide, the raft was completed just in time. On July 5th, strong gale winds began battering the already compromised Medusa. Panic spread, and Captain Chaumaret ordered an immediate evacuation. With only 6 lifeboats available, barely over 200 passengers could be accommodated, so they made the last-minute decision to use the newly built raft as a 7th lifeboat for the remaining 147 passengers. Designed simply to float, the raft had no sail, no hull shape for stability, and barely held together under the added weight. The plan was to tow it the 31 miles to shore, attaching it to the lifeboats with ropes in hopes it would hold. After 2 grueling miles of sluggish towing, the lifeboat crews decided their pace was far too slow, and worsening weather threatened to put them all at risk. In a desperate move, they cut the ropes and sped toward shore, abandoning La Machine and its 147 passengers some 30 miles from land, with no means of navigation. For the 146 men and 1 woman left on the raft, their situation went from dire to unimaginable. The raft carried only a couple of small casks of drinking water, but was loaded with wine barrels from the voyage, and many turned to it as their only resource. The first night after abandonment, a storm hit, violently tossing the raft. Men fell overboard, swept away by the sea, while disputes broke out among those left as they fought for dry space. By morning, 20 lives had already been lost. On the second day, the raft was in chaos. The relentless sun beat down on survivors already weakened from hunger, thirst, and exposure. Their water supply was running dangerously low, and the wine they'd relied on for comfort had quickly become a curse. Delirium began to set in, with many losing their grip on reality under the strain of dehydration and desperation. By the third day, their food had run out entirely. Driven to unthinkable measures, some men turned to those who had already perished, seeing no other way to survive. Tensions escalated as desperation grew, sparking violent conflicts among the survivors. Faced with impossible choices, some reluctantly turned to the remains of fallen comrades to stave off starvation. By the 4th day, 80 passengers had perished, lost to starvation, violence, or drowning. Those left behind, now in a state of complete madness, turned on each other in mounting chaos. Another mutiny broke out, and this time the officers barely managed to regain control, casting the rebellion's ringleaders into the sea to restore order. On the 8th day, the fittest survivors, struggling to conserve what little remained of their resources, made the heartbreaking decision to cast the weakest and most wounded overboard. This left just 15 men on the raft. These 15 men survived another 4 days until July 17th, when a miracle appeared on the horizon. The Argus, one of the original ships bound for Senegal, had been following their slightly longer route along the West African coast when its crew spotted the distant raft. The Argus, a smaller and more agile brig, could navigate the shallow waters that had trapped the Medusa and approached to investigate. What the sailors found shocked them. Of the original 147 on the raft, only 15 survivors remained. It had been 12 days since being abandoned by the Medusa's lifeboats, and they were barely alive, many too weak to stand or even signal for help. The rest had perished in the brutal struggle to survive. The survivors were taken aboard the Argus and brought back to France, where their story quickly spread when a prominent newspaper covered the event in graphic detail. Public outrage surged as people learned of the French government's negligence and the political favoritism that had led to the appointment of an unqualified captain. The incident soon became a national scandal, raising questions about the government's competence and pressuring officials to reform the Navy's hiring practices. Captain Chaumaret quickly became a symbol of disgrace. He was court-martialed for his catastrophic decisions and sentenced to 3 years in prison. However, the story of the Medusa would not have received the same level of attention if not for the artist Theodore Géricault. Géricault was a young, ambitious French painter, known for his dramatic and emotional style. Deeply moved by the survivors' harrowing accounts, he set to immortalize the tragedy in what would become one of the most iconic works of French art, appropriately titled The Raft of the Medusa. Géricault's painting is a monumental work, measuring over 16 feet tall and 23 feet wide. It depicts the moment of rescue, with the few remaining survivors desperately signaling to the distant Argus. The painting doesn't just illustrate the event, it captures the agony, the desperation, and the loss of humanity that defined the survivors' ordeal. At the time, the painting shocked and captivated the public. It wasn't just a depiction of a disaster, it was a powerful symbol of human suffering and endurance. Géricault spent months researching the event, even interviewing survivors and visiting morgues to study corpses so he could accurately depict the physical toll of the ordeal. Today, the Raft of the Medusa is housed in the Louvre Museum in Paris, where it remains one of the world's most iconic and recognizable works of art. It's a cautionary reminder that even in our civilized societies, when people are stripped of resources and structure, the darkness of human nature can quickly emerge. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe for more extraordinary survival stories. We look at true tales of extreme adventure, resilience, and survival against the odds. Thanks for watching, and hope to see you in the next one.